Hello guys, and today I'm going to show you a queen sacrifice by my opponent which very nearly worked. It's not a typical blunder where you can say yes, they made a mistake, they weren't looking, or they just weren't looking carefully enough. I believe they did it strategically and deliberately. I don't think it was an accidental mistake. I think given how near my queen was to their queen, there was no way they could think it was an accidental mistake. I believe they did it deliberately as part of a plan, and I'm even going to show you what I think their plan was. But unfortunately, they hadn't banked on me, and I managed to turn it around so they not only lost their queen, they actually lost their king, i.e. checkmate. But I very nearly was checkmated as a result of this queen sacrifice. And if I hadn't been careful enough, I would have lost very quickly afterwards. And I'll show you why now. Firstly, I'm just going to show you the game. Nothing too amazing so far. I thought there might be a sacrifice, there might be an exchange, but there wasn't. I threatened their bishop, they move back. This is to threaten their queen, so they move their queen out of the way. You'll notice here that I was threatening that if I had to move my knight in such a way it could then threaten their queen. But they decided to take one of my pawns. I moved my king out of the way, so if it took the rook I could take their queen. They decided to go on a pawn taking spree. I've moved the rook there so that if the queen takes the rook, the knight will take the queen, and so the queen is being threatened. They decide to put me in check. I'll just move out the way. It gets very interesting now. They start checking me quite a lot. And my king is starting to feel a bit trapped. I have to give them credit where credit is due here for actually trying. Now, for some stupid reason, they castled again. They didn't need to do so. My king is pinned in. It can't move very much. They could also take my bishop if they wanted to, but for some dumb reason that I don't understand, they decided castling would be better. Why? I have absolutely no idea, but never mind. Maybe there's some logic in it that I've missed here. I'm just going to check something. I didn't check at the time. No, I wonder if I've done that. No, I could have taken that, so it wasn't such a good idea. Okay, anyway, we'll go back. They castled anyway, so why again? I have no idea, but never mind. I can see maybe they are trying to protect their bishop here, but we'll see what happens anyway. They then decide to move their bishop closer. making it my king even more pinned in, even though it didn't need to do that. Probably they just felt it was easy to manipulate. I've no idea why, but never mind. I felt that I was pinned in a bit too much, and the knight looked a bit too threatening. So I decided to take it. Now I've got a bit more freedom. Now my king is again boxed in a lot. There's not much I can do, and it's not a good place to be. But let's see what happens now. I take their bishop, so their rook, they take my bishop. I now have a bit more breathing space. I now threaten their queen, but the real thing I'm trying to do is I'm trying to move up here after I've taken the pawn. That is my real aim, but I'm not sure they realise that. They're offering a queen exchange. Yeah, but I take that, and then that takes that. I instead decide to move my knight out. So I reject the queen exchange at this time, but still threaten their queen. And they can still have the option of a queen exchange if they want, but it would be on my terms, not theirs. For some reason they decided to decline the sacrifice and exchange at this time and take a pawn instead. I move my knight to threaten the queen. This is where it gets very, very, very interesting. You will notice here that they took the rook. They can't possibly have missed the fact that my queen would take it afterwards. It's too near for it to be a total blunder. So, and I believe there's a lot of logic behind it, which I'm going to explain afterwards. I now took their queen with my queen. This is where they started to try and become a bit more clever. They moved their king down. This is to try to pin in for some reason, I think they were trying to protect the bishop, so I couldn't later easily take it, and to try to start pinning me in. I then took the pawn. This was a brilliant master move by them, and it almost almost looks like a checkmate. Because I could not go there. I could not go there. The only place I can move the king is there. If I move the king, which I did not actually do. But if I had moved the king, that is the only place I could have moved the king to. So it was an excellent move, and I'm going to show you what would have happened if I had moved the king at the end of the game. So bear in mind that's the only place I could move the king if I actually moved the king. Instead, I did something that may have looked a bit not very obvious. Instead, I simply moved a pawn up. Never underestimate the defensive power of a pawn. It can save you the whole game. Now you might think, well, what am I talking about? Well, now my opponent decided to do this. What this had to do with it, I don't know, but they probably wanted to try and start moving the rook, which is what they did later. I now put them in check. For some reason, they moved down. This was a catastrophic move for them. Sorry. And now it's all over for them, realistically. And I'll show you why. Their king is now trapped. Their king can't move there because of this pawn, and it can't move there or there because of the rook, and it can't move here or here because of my king. So their king is now completely trapped. They moved their rook over, threatening my queen via a pin. Their aim was to later move out. It could have been here, it could have been anything they intended to do, with the intention of in some way pinning my king in. In fact, perhaps they had hoped that I might do something silly and move my queen out of the way. They thought I might move my queen to safety somewhere, and then they could start moving the bishop and threatening with me with the rook. But I didn't. The next move, checkmate. Their king is completely pinned in, and it could not move at all, as I showed you, and by putting my queen next to my king, it was checkmate. But as I said to you, and I did promise earlier, the sacrifice they made wasn't absolutely stupid. there was some logic in it if I hadn't been clever enough to do what I did. Why? Well, supposing, as I said, I hadn't, in fact, moved the pawn. Supposing that move had never happened. Another alternative could be I could have moved this knight instead to block it, because it would be protected by the queen. I showed you the move I actually did, but I'm going to assume that pretending instead I had done what many people did, react, panic, and instead move the king. This is what I think they were banking on. As I said, if I move the king, there's only one square where I can move the king to, and that is here. Because I couldn't move the king, as I showed you before, to there because of this pawn. I couldn't move it to there because of this bishop, and I couldn't move it to there because of this bishop. So therefore, if I wanted to move the king, that was the only place I could move it. The next move that my opponent would have done would be this, which would have been checkmate. So if I'd moved the king out of the way to the only square where I could move the king, if I had moved the king, it would then have been a guaranteed checkmate. So there was, I believe, that there was some logic in their queen sacrifice. Maybe. Because if they'd simply moved their bishop there, I could have simply taken it with that or that, with either the queen or the rook. But as I said, instead, they thought they were being clever with a queen sacrifice by taking my rook. Possibly because they just wanted my queen out of the way. And maybe they assumed I would do something like that. But they simply weren't prepared for me blocking it in that way. So I managed to avert a potential checkmate and instead have a checkmate of my own. Thanks for watching. Bye.